our completion. Last Sunday, so today what I want to do is I want to get to the heart of all of this, and that's what can we say about the and you know, the bottom line here is when it comes to this kind of thing, it's really not so much a question about proof as it's a question about love. And I mean that on several levels. I mean, one is just love of God. Shut that door, please. It's beautiful. People demand empirical proof of the resurrection. You might want to ask if they've ever been loved. And when they say, well, yes, ask them, oh, how do you know? And then when they say, well, of course I know. Well, how do you know? And then when they go into, well, the things that people do that we interpret to mean love, you could say, okay, is there any other possible explanation for those behaviors? I mean, we know, but there are simply things in life that we accept as true without demanding empirical proof. And the resurrection is kind of like that, only it's actually a little bit better, because it's not that we have no proof, it's not that we can't say anything about the resurrection, but there are standards of proof in history for historians that are different than the standards of proof in a laboratory. So, which is to say, the bottom line when it comes to history is the goal is to arrive at some sort of conclusion where we can say there's a high probability that such and such happened. The study of history isn't like science. The study of history is the study of the unusual and the unrepeatable. Whereas in an empirical study, there are conditions that need to exist, and these conditions need to be able to be recreated so that scientists from anywhere can recreate these conditions and get the same results. But it isn't that way with history. I mean, if it was that way with history, there would only be one history book on the assassination of JFK. Right? But there isn't. There are reams of people looking at the same data and coming up with, well, little nuances and differences in things. Now, this doesn't mean that historical investigation is pointless. It just means that, like I said, we want to arrive at a place where we can say there's a high probability that such and such did in fact occur, and that these events created the conditions necessary for blank to occur, whatever that is. So, in his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, N.T. Wright offers an argument for the historicity of the resurrection using tools that are called necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something that has to be true in order for the conclusion to follow. It is a necessary condition for my computer at home to work that my home is connected to an electrical supply. That is a necessary condition. A sufficient condition is something that will certainly and without fail bring about the conclusion. It is a sufficient condition that if there is a sweet 16 celebration party going outside my bedroom window, I will not have a good night's sleep that night. That's a sufficient condition. Now we can understand the difference between necessary and sufficient when we examine alternatives. Having my house connected to an electrical supply is a necessary condition for my computer to work, but it is not a sufficient condition because any one of a number of other things could go wrong to make my computer not work. Electricity is necessary, but it isn't the only thing that is needed in order for my computer to work. Whereas a party going outside my bedroom window is certainly a sufficient reason for me not to get a good night's sleep, but it isn't necessary when a pneumatic drill could do just as well. You see? All right? So, when we look at these, and I've given you a handout, so you can, if you want to follow along, you can. I'm going to walk through some steps that N.T. Wright goes through, and as he applies these standards of necessary and sufficient conditions. And the first thing, I'm going to run through them and then I'm going to go back and elaborate on some of them a little bit more. So, number one, the world of Second Temple Judaism supplied the concept of resurrection. We looked at that. We looked at how the Old Testament has this concept of resurrection. But Christianity, if you will, changed it. It mutated from what we have in the Old Testament to something different. And that rules out the possibility that it could have just generated spontaneously within that world. And here's the reason why. Jesus wasn't the only would-be Messiah. There were other heroes, there were other leaders, there were other would-be Messiahs. And if the concept of resurrection in the Old Testament was sufficient to lead to the conclusion that someone could rise from the dead, well, when we would wonder why other people didn't arrive at this conclusion with other leaders, heroes, or would-be messiahs. But they did not. When we ask the early Christians what led them to their belief in Jesus' resurrection, their answer is twofold. The tomb was empty, and Jesus appeared to them, and having every appearance as being thoroughly well and alive. Number two, neither the empty tomb by itself, nor the appearances by themselves could have generated the Christian belief in the resurrection. The empty tomb alone would have been tragedy and puzzle. Sightings of an apparently alive Jesus would have led people to conclude they were having a vision or hallucination. Those things were well enough known in the ancient world. But bring us to number three. When we take the two and put them together, we have a powerful reason for their emergence, for the emergence of Christian belief. They are sufficient when they are together. Number four, the meaning of resurrection, as I've gone over again and again and again, the meaning of resurrection, meaning bodily resurrection, makes it impossible to conceive of this Christian belief without it being known that a body had disappeared and that that person had been discovered to be thoroughly alive again. In other words, the empty tomb plus the appearances are necessary. Number five, the other explanations offered for the emergence of belief in Jesus' resurrection do not possess the same explanatory power. Hopefully I'm going to have time to go into that. And six, therefore it is highly probable that Jesus' tomb was indeed empty on the third day after his resurrection, and that the disciples did indeed encounter him alive and well. So now I'm going to go back and flush these out a little bit further. Number one is pretty straightforward. Our basic premise is that the empty tomb plus the appearances are the two things that the Christians point to when we ask them, why do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? We know that this could have happened within the context of Second Temple Judaism because of a belief in the resurrection. But it is extremely unlikely that this would have just generated all on its own unless we have an empty tomb and the appearances to account for the mutation of the belief in resurrection from its Second Temple Judaism understanding to the Christian understanding of resurrection. So, I'm going to split this into two parts. We're going to look at the empty tomb without the appearances and the appearances without the empty tomb. The empty tomb without the appearances. This would have produced a distressing puzzle, but not a long-term dilemma. I mean, if you were a Second Temple Jew and someone told you that the tomb was empty, what would be your first conclusion? Somebody stole the body. Exactly. Somebody robbed the tomb. It would have suggested nothing else. Okay. You can make an executive decision. That's fine. This is high altar versus low altar. Okay.
Will that affect our understanding of the resurrection?
Oh, that was beautiful.
So an empty tomb all by itself proves nothing. It would have proved nothing. No one in the ancient world would have come to the conclusion that someone had rose from the dead because the tomb was empty. Not in the pagan world, not in the Jewish world. Certainly the disciples were not expecting it. And had the empty tomb, had the tomb been empty without any other unusual occurrences, just no one would have said that Jesus was, gee whiz, after all, he was the Messiah. They wouldn't have come to that conclusion. By itself, it is an insufficient account for Christian belief. Now, someone who's savvy might point to John 20, verse 8. The beloved disciple goes into the empty tomb, sees the grave clothes lying separate from the headcloth, and believes, John tells us. Is this evidence that the empty tomb alone is sufficient? And Wright argues that no, it is not. The way John has carefully described the scene suggests that the grave clothes are to be understood as an additional sign of what happened to Jesus, a sign that is the functional equivalent of the appearances. The beloved disciple, John wants us to understand, came to believe not just on the basis of an empty tomb, but because of the way the grave clothes were left behind. They suggested that that the body had not been moved. They suggested that the body, if you will, passed through them, much like Jesus appears and disappears through locked doors. So the test holds, by itself, the empty tomb is insufficient to account for Christian belief. So what about the meetings and appearances by themselves? Well, similarly, without an empty tomb, they are not sufficient. Again, this is a review of things I've said. In the ancient world, people were pretty familiar with stories of visions and appearances of recently dead people. And various theories can be given about the psychological state of someone's mind who had such an experience. On the other hand, there are some indicators that at least on occasion, there seems to be reason to believe that these have some basis in actual history, such as a deceased person appears to someone who doesn't know they're deceased. And how do you explain that? Such experiences, though, did not normally involve physical contact. But here's the thing. If you were to survey all of the experiences that people might have had in the ancient world about encountering someone who had died, whether they were physical or not, whether they ate or not, the thing is that they always concluded the same thing, that the person was dead. that the encounter was with a dead person, not someone who was alive. So, by themselves, the appearances are thoroughly insufficient for Christian belief. There has to be something else to account for this, along with the appearances. I mean, even if several visions were experienced, if the tomb was still occupied, the experiences would have been chalked up to an encounter with the dead Jesus, not a risen one. Now, as with the beloved disciple in John chapter 20, there is a counter-argument that someone might make, and that would be Paul. Didn't Paul come to believe simply on the basis of an appearance of Jesus? Well, it isn't that straightforward. Paul, remember, was a persecutor of Christians. And it's inconceivable that he would be unaware that the Christian claim was that the tomb was empty and that it had never been falsified. There was no reason to believe that Rome had produced the body. There was no story about that. That doesn't necessarily mean that Paul believed it, but he was aware of it. He was aware that at least Christians believed that the tomb was empty. And so it follows that his encounter with Jesus took place in the context of the knowledge of the empty tomb. Okay? Put these together, we're back to number 3, the empty tomb and the appearances, Wright argues, are sufficient to account for the early Christian belief. He does, though, add a nuance, because not everyone who heard about the empty tomb and the appearances believed. Not everyone. But granted that the first witnesses were Second Temple Jews who had followed Jesus, they had hoped that he would turn out to be Israel's Messiah. For them, the empty tomb plus the appearances were sufficient to make them conclude that he had been raised from the dead. They were not sufficient for everyone, but they are completely sufficient for that belief to arise within a community which began with Jesus and his followers and spread outwards from there. So that's the argument for its sufficiency. Is it necessary? Is the empty tomb and the appearances necessary? And Wright says that this is a harder task. I'll quote from him now. He said, "This is the point at which we must declare that the matter lies beyond historical proof. It will always be possible for some ingenious historians to propose variations on the well-worn theme of how early Christians could come to their belief without either the empty tomb or the appearances. However, the meaning of resurrection within the ancient world rules out most of the alternatives. And the principal alternative theories that have been advanced are insufficient. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them. So, with regard to point number 4, as I've stated again, the resurrection was not a word that was used to describe someone who had just gone to heaven or had been exalted in some new way. It always was a word that involved new bodily life. And Wright argues that it just doesn't work to suggest that because the disciples lived in a world where resurrection was expected, that they would have just applied this word to Jesus. And again, this is something that other historians do. Well, there was the belief in the resurrection. And there are all these other stories of resurrection. Well, but what about the other leaders, the other heroes, the other would-be messiahs? How come it's just with Jesus that the word resurrection gets applied? If this was such a common thing, if it's just so easy for us to imagine that the ancient world was someplace where miracles happened and was bound to happen sooner or later, why didn't this happen with the other leaders? That's a big gaping hole in some of these alternative theories. Wright, therefore, regards the empty tomb as a necessary condition. Again, by itself it's insufficient, but it's necessary. And he also believes the same thing about the appearances. The appearances are a necessary supplement to the empty tomb. He says, though, that this is difficult to demonstrate. Once again, there's no limit to ingenuity. People can come up with all kinds of theories and phenomena that could explain away the appearances. But at least for now, it seems to be the best explanation. And hopefully this will become clearer as I go. The appearances actually provide the foundation for Paul's belief in the resurrection. And in particular, his sort of depiction of the resurrection as having continuity and discontinuity with our earthly bodies. Much like Jesus' body, resurrected body, had continuity to his earthly body, but there was also discontinuity. It was somehow different. It was physical, but it could come and go. People looked at him and knew he was Jesus, but still wanted to ask who he was. So that there's some amount of discontinuity there as well. So we're left with the conclusion that the combination of the empty tomb and the appearances form a set of circumstances that are necessary and sufficient. So to poke holes at the possibility that there are other, that they're not necessary, I'm going to talk about two alternative theories. Actually, there's three, but there's one I've already hinted at. Some people have supposed that because the ancient world believed in miracles, the belief in the resurrection was inevitable. But a careful examination of the New Testament shows that that's not what the New Testament teaches. The New Testament doesn't teach that people rise from the dead, and Jesus was one of them. It's people don't rise from the dead, and Jesus did anyway. That something new happened. It's built into Christian belief that people don't rise from the dead. That's what makes this so extraordinary. Okay? That's particularly important when we come to the first alternative theory called the cognitive dissonance theory. This is an alternative. Cognitive dissonance is a state in which individuals or groups fail to come to terms with reality, but instead they live in a fantasy world of their own making. This theory gained traction through the work of a guy by the name of Leon Festinger. The thing is, in order for cognitive dissonance to work, there has to be a profound and deep underlying expectation. Something profound that someone is hoping for. And when the outcome doesn't come to pass, people pretend that it came to pass. Or think that it came to pass. Or refuse to accept the evidence that it didn't come to pass. The problem with the theory is that no one expected Jesus to rise from the dead. No one expected it. There's no way to account for this mutation. The first Christians came to their belief because something happened, which was not at all what they expected or hoped for. It was actually something that they had to reorient their lives around. They actually had to work at reorienting their lives around this new reality and come to terms with what it could possibly mean that someone would rise from the dead. It's not like, and N.T. Wright borrows this image from World War II, the resurrection stories are not like confused Japanese citizens refusing to reconcile themselves to defeat and instead continue to cling to their belief that they must have won the war and that all evidence to the contrary was cunning enemy propaganda. He says that rather they are like people who, discovering they had been fighting for the wrong side, at once changed their allegiance and applied for citizenship in the victorious country. So he really pokes big holes in this cognitive dissonance theory. And the biggest one is, in order for a whole group of people to live in La La Land, there has to be some sort of hope that they share. But they didn't share the hope that they saw. What they encountered in Jesus wasn't something that anyone had hoped for. Another alternative is what Wright calls a new experience of grace. Edward Schillebeeckx, a biblical theologian in the 1970s, put forward this theory, and it goes like this. The first Christians, especially Peter, had a wonderful experience of grace and forgiveness, of seeing and enlightenment, which we could describe as conversion. This had nothing to do with an empty tomb or the appearances of Jesus. But at a certain point, in large part, I think, resulting from the practice of visiting the tomb, stories of an empty tomb emerged, coupled with language like on the third day, which had nothing to do with chronology and everything to do with metaphorically evoking an awareness of divine presence. And gradually this morphed into stories of Jesus being seen. Now, his book, Sheila Beek's book is quite big, so I've just condensed a whole lot, okay? But the bottom line is that for a scholar to suggest that a new experience of grace and forgiveness are necessary and sufficient conditions for the rise of Christian belief, then once again, he or she has to explain why they were not necessary and sufficient in the case of other leaders of Judaism. Why not Bar Kokhba, a would-be Messiah that was beloved? Why not any one of a number of Jewish heroes or leaders? And there were categories for expressing divine forgiveness in the Jewish world, but the death of an executed leader wasn't one of them. I mean, even if we concede that Jesus had spoken many times of forgiveness during his public ministry, and even if we concede that the disciples remembered and cherished those words following his death, that does not make for the conditions needed to declare him alive. I mean, after all, the Psalms speak of forgiveness. Isaiah speaks of forgiveness, but no one tried to suggest that David was still alive or that Isaiah was still alive. So the empty tomb plus the appearances present us with both a necessary and sufficient condition to account for the rise of early Christian belief. Nothing else that historians have been able to come up with has the power to explain the phenomenon in front of us. Now, a lot of what follows now is pretty much right out of N.T. Wright's book, but this just seemed to me to be very important to try to convey to you. It remains unprovable in empirical terms. All right? None of what I've just said proves that Jesus rose from the dead. But like I said, history is not like that. We're looking for high probability. And this is attained by examining the possibilities and looking at the evidence and asking, does this explain the phenomena in front of us? It's always possible that someone can come up with an explanation that provides an alternative, sufficient condition for the rise of Christianity. But it's worth noting that since this type of biblical study emerged, which is 200 years ago, no explanation has been given that has the power of explaining everything like the empty tomb and the appearances. The early Christians did not invent the empty tomb as a way to explain faith that they already had. Remember the first day I was talking about, that was one of the theories, that Christians had this belief that they projected back onto Jesus as a way of defending what they believed. No, that does not work. They came to such faith because something happened. No one was expecting it to happen. No kind of conversion experience would lead them to the idea that someone had risen from the dead, no matter how guilty they felt, no matter how forgiven they felt. N.T. Wright says, to suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter into a fantasy world of our own. In terms of the kind of proof which historians normally accept, the case I have presented, N.T. Wright says, that the tomb plus appearances combination is what generated early Christian belief, is as watertight as one is likely to find. This conclusion provides the framework in which other pieces of historical evidence can be fitted. These other pieces don't make a case, but they add to the hypothesis. For example, that the first day of the week became a special day. Now, that all by itself doesn't mean anything. But when you take the empty tomb and the appearances and the fact that the first day became our special day, it's beginning to sound like the resurrection stories are telling the same thing. They're telling the same story. Yeah?
Wouldn't the bodily ascension of Jesus be more evidence of...
Not for the resurrection. That's not. That's a different ball. That's a different kettle of fish. It doesn't prove that he rose from the dead. Actually, what it proves is that he's the Messiah, the world's true Lord. There's no evidence to suggest that anyone ever venerated Jesus' tomb. And third, and this is important, this is probably the most important, there's no question of anyone ever performing a secondary burial of Jesus. Remember that burials were two stages. Stage one, the body is wrapped and with spices to offset putrefaction, and graves were used by families for other members of the family who died. And so people would come and go over a course of time to bury other people, and some amount of time would pass. Who knows? It could be months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, whatever. But one day someone goes into the tomb and notices that there's nothing but bones left where Jesus was lying. They would gather up those bones, put them in an ossuary, and then either place them in a niche in that tomb or somewhere else. And so if we take even just a year or so after that, let's say it only took a year for his bones to deteriorate, by then the news is already spreading that there are people claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, that his body didn't decay, that people had encountered him alive. And Joseph of Arimathea, or any one of his family members, could have said, hello, we just collected his bones and here's where they're buried. That doesn't happen. There is a fascinating side note here. There was an inscription found near Nazareth, dated to the reign of Claudius, who was emperor between 49 and 54 AD. And the inscription forbid tampering with tombs. It may have nothing to do with the question at hand, or it might. If we suppose that word got out about a new sect that was hailing a recently executed king of the Jews as the Messiah, perhaps along the lines of Matthew 28, 11 and 15, if that had been floating around, it's not beyond possibility that some resourceful Roman official would claim in the name of the emperor that, tombs shouldn't be tampered with. You can't make an argument from that. Unfortunately, archaeological evidence like this usually raises more questions than it does answers, but it's just sort of tantalizing. So the bottom line for Wright is that for all of these reasons, he writes this, I conclude that the empty tomb and the meetings with Jesus are historical events. They took place as real events. They are significant events. And they are, in the normal sense, required by historians, provable events. We cannot account for early Christianity without them. And they're backed by methodological standards called, and I'm sorry to throw this at you, hopefully this will make some sense. There's a standard in historical investigation called double similarity and double dissimilarity. When I lay out what's going on, hopefully it will be easier to see. Stories like these, with the kind of explanation the early Christians offered, make sense in the world of Second Temple Judaism. Similarity. Okay, resurrection. We've got some similarity. There is at least belief in the resurrection. But the way that belief morphed and mutated is unlike that which was in first century Judaism. Dissimilarity. Similarity, dissimilarity. Okay, stories like these, I gotta find my place here. Stories like these do indeed explain the rise of early Christianity. So in other words, when we look at the resurrection story and Paul's teaching on the resurrection, we see similarity. We see similarity there. But we can't take Paul's teaching on the resurrection and back project it onto Jesus. That's dissimilarity. You understand what I'm saying? So there's similarity when you follow the evidence. As you follow it, you come from Judaism to the mutation to Paul. It all makes sense. But there's dissimilarity. The mutation is not like what Jews were expecting. And what was encountered, we cannot just say that Paul back projected onto it for all these other reasons that I've already gone over. It just doesn't make any sense that he would back project on it. It's right, though, this whole thing is right for historians to still say it couldn't have happened that way. There's something called, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, a priori. A-P-R-I-O-R-I. A priori. It means that when you're examining something, you rule out certain conclusions in advance. You rule them out in advance. So that if your evidence leads you to such a conclusion, you will then say to yourself, I either did it wrong, or there's some other reason. Because this can't happen. That's a priori. So obviously what people will do is dead people don't rise from the dead as a foregone conclusion. Therefore, there must be some other reason to explain the phenomenon. But Wright goes on and he says, but in any other case of historical examination, if you were to follow the evidence like this, you would, as an historian, come to the conclusion and accept it without a moment's hesitation. Except for the fact that in this case what we're talking about is resurrection from the dead. But if we took that out of the equation, the process is the same for any other kind of historical examination. Historians do this kind of stuff all the time and come to conclusions. I mean, even in the case of John F. Kennedy, or the 9/11 truthers, okay? Yeah, there are all kinds of people with wacky ideas about what happened, but most historians can come to general conclusions that they can agree on about what happened. Okay, and they do it by this same type of investigation. But for reasons, because this is about someone rising from the dead, people assume that there must be some other explanation. There might be another reason, though, too. And that's because to come to the conclusion and to say that Jesus rose from the dead, that's not something that can be said dispassionately. That's not something that you can just, he rose from the dead. I mean, maybe you could, I suppose. Wright argues, C.S. Lewis before him argues, that it means that it matters a lot. It means that if this is true, if Jesus rose from the dead, it means that I have to realign my life around this new reality. I need to live in a new way. I need to let this reality challenge me in a new way and change my life accordingly. All right? I'm going to stop. I'm going to end at 10 o'clock. We got 10 minutes. Anything, do you understand the sufficient and necessary? That the tomb and the appearances create the conditions that lead to this belief. I mean, when you boil it down and you read the resurrection stories, I'm not going to really have time to go into each of the resurrection stories in the Gospels. We only have one more session. But the thing you need to know is that, yes, every gospel writer wrote their gospel with a particular perspective in mind. They do write it from the perspective of faith. They write it as believers. They're writing them for evangelistic purposes. They are not trying to write dispassionate history of, well, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Each of them are taking the events of Jesus' life, and in some cases actually rearranging them chronologically because they want to tell it a certain way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. The bottom line, when you get to the resurrection, is that whatever happened, there was an empty tomb, and Jesus appeared to people with every appearance of not only being alive, but being really well, and yet strangely different. Whether Peter got to the tomb first, or the beloved disciple got to the tomb first, who knows? Who knows? I mean, some argue that maybe John is trying to argue supremacy of one apostle over the other. I don't know. Who knows? People can argue the details, the nitpick the details, but the point here is that underlying all of it are these two things. Something dramatic happened to change the world forever. Yeah.
Quick question is, the other would-be messiahs, how did they die? Did they get marked? Did they get killed like Jesus did? Or
Yeah,
did
they would die various ways. Sometimes they were executed.
Okay.
Not necessarily, I don't remember whether they were all crucified, but they had more than one way to execute.
So they were threatening to...
Yeah, many of them they might have died in battle. Some of them were executed. But if we just take the ones that were executed, no one said, oh gee whiz, Bar Kokhba was Messiah, really. We had this wonderful experience of grace. Or they saw him later. In other words, the general belief in a resurrection in Second Temple Judaism did not lead Jews to conclude that their leader had been risen from the dead when he had been killed. It's not as if the belief of resurrection created the conditions for such a belief to arise naturally and spontaneously and automatically. It had to be certain things that happened. And the argument, of course, is that in Jesus' case, unlike anybody else's case, empty tomb and appearances in bodily form.
The other thing I was just going to say is, even with all the historical steps that you outlined here, and looking back at it, like for people who don't believe, it's just, and for me, it was acceptance that there is something, and I use the word supernatural, but it's beyond what is the natural order of things. And if you don't believe that, no matter what you say about, so that was a real challenge for me, because it's like, if you know the natural order, that is supernatural. When somebody said that word here in Christ Church, I was like, and that was after I had come to faith, I was like, how can I believe this? But it's like, oh, there are things beyond which we understand how they happen.
Right. And people who make this kind of argument are making an a priori argument. Jesus can't rise from the dead because no one rises from the dead. That's an a priori argument. You're going to come at the evidence with a preconceived conclusion of what couldn't happen. And then when the evidence says that it did happen, you'll say, well, that can't be right.
Right.
Well, that's an a priori argument. And in any other argument, a priori arguments don't work. They're not acceptable. It's just that because of the extraordinary nature of this particular one, people think that for some reason it does work. Well, if you want to be an historian, and again, remember, we're not talking laboratory science here. We're not talking about repeatable events. If you want to be an historian, then if you're going to follow the evidence where the evidence leads, well, then this is the conclusion. That's N.T. Wright's argument. And if you say, shrug your shoulders and say, well, no, that can't be right, well, you're really not doing history anymore. You're doing something else. But let me just say, I've never known anyone to get argued into the kingdom of heaven. By reasoned, rational argument. Maybe it's happened, I just don't know of it. So you can bring all this evidence. In other words, you can bring all this evidence and pour it out, but if someone's heart is not ready,
Right.
it's like Pharaoh,
Yeah.
and a hardened heart, then there isn't anything you're going to do. It's going to be up to the Spirit. Anything else? Any other questions?
And the being Pentecost, so the factor of the Holy Spirit into this whole story, that's significant too.
Sure.
Of course, because even if there was a resurrection, just the story of it wouldn't have been enough to spread Christianity.
Yeah, I think, once we get into the book of Acts, the Spirit explains the zeal, but not just the zeal, but the Spirit enabled the apostles to back up their testimony with, mighty works and acts and things like that. And I think that still happens today. I'm going to give the farm away, but that's my sermon today, is about how the Spirit works. And for me, what am I trying to say? The benefit of allowing the Spirit to do what He wills is the confirmation that Jesus is really alive, that He really is raised from the dead. And I think the ascension, going back to the ascension, that's another piece of the puzzle. That isn't what caused them to believe. It's the empty tomb and the appearances. But then you add the ascension, then you add Pentecost, and it really does build up and snowball in a big way. All right, well, next week, I do want to look briefly at John. The only time I'm going to have to really look at one of the resurrection stories, I'm going to look at John next week. That's my favorite, and he obviously tells the juicier story. And the fascinating thing is that in the years since I graduated from seminary, the thinking about John was that he's so late that it must really not be related to history. But actually, the scholarly consensus is that now, even people like Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jewish biblical theologian of the New Testament, but she's Jewish, she's not a believer, at the clergy conference a couple weeks ago, said to us that the scholarly consensus now is that John may in fact be much closer to history than we ever thought that he was. So, stay tuned. See you next week.